Hello, my name is Madison Fisher, and today I will be presenting my PowerPoint on group grief counseling. Let's talk a little bit about uncomplicated grief. Simply put, uncomplicated grief encompasses normal grief toward healthy adaptation to the tasks of mourning within a reasonable time frame. This is from Worden, 2018, the author of our text. And for the goals of mourning, the counselor is there to help facilitate the goals and tasks of mourning for the grieving client. Some of these tasks include increasing the reality of the loss, helping the counselee deal with both the emotional and behavioral pain associated, of course, with that grief, and also helping the counselee overcome various impediments to the readjustment, external, internal, and spiritual after the loss. And finally, the counselor is also there to help the counselee find a way to remember and or maintain a bond with the deceased while moving forward to reinvest in life. And this is from, again, our textbook, Worden 2018. After discussing the tasks of mourning, it's also important for us to consider the mediators of mourning. What are the mediators that our textbook is talking about? Well, the goals of mourning will remain the same, but they may be affected by the mediators of grief. Some of these mediators include kinship, or who died, the nature of the attachment, how the person died, historical antecedents, personality variables, social variables, concurrent losses and stresses. And this is all from our textbook, and the author is Worden, 2018. So it's important for the counselor to consider these mediators because they will verify the existence of bonds of meaning between the bereaved and the lost being. And that's from Suarez et alia, 2024. Some of these mediators are important to note, such as kinship, like who was it that died? Who was it that is lost? Is it a coworker at work that you really don't run into all that much? Or is it your beloved husband or wife? This will greatly affect your grieving process, right? The nature of the attachment, so again, how close were you to that person? How the person died. A traumatic death might be harder to come back from than someone who is in prolonged suffering. And then also historical antecedents, like your personal history with this person, and also your personal history. Have you experienced loss before? Have you never experienced grief before like this? Personality variables, of course, depending on one's personality, they might be able to bounce back from grief faster than others, or they might want to stuff it down, and some people might just want to get it all out there with friends. It really all depends on the personality. Social variables, what is culturally acceptable? What is a culturally acceptable way to grieve versus not a culturally acceptable way to grieve in your society? And then also concurrent losses and stresses. Of course, people have stresses and losses all the time, but those can compact on one another. So if you lose a dear friend at the same time you are trying to sell your house, I can't imagine that would be just a lot to deal with, right? So that's kind of a brief explanation of the mediators that our textbook is talking about. And these mediators will often determine the intensity and length of the mourning process. But how do we know when it is time to seek help? How do people know when it's time to seek help for their grief? Who, when, where? So many questions to be asked. Who provides grief counseling? Well, in order to help achieve the aforementioned goals mentioned previously, a variety of counselors can be employed. These can be a licensed professional counselor, like we are all trying to become, but they may also be trained doctors, nurses, psychologists, or even social workers who support a person who has sustained a significant loss. This was from our textbook, Word in 2018. And additionally, trained volunteers may even be employed for this task as well. But the important thing to note is that it is vital for the person helping achieve the goals of the mourning or the grieving process to be trained to better and most effectively equip the person who is grieving. When is grief counseling needed? Our text explains that grief counseling typically begins around a week after the funeral in order to give the grieving some time to process the recent death. So you don't want to do it too soon. You want to have a little bit of time, but you also don't want to wait a whole lot because it is going to be important to receive help so that you can begin your healing process as soon as possible. And where is grief counseling conducted? Grief counseling, like any other form of counseling, does not have to be confined to four walls like of an office space. The author of our text states that among a variety of locations, grief counseling may take place in an office, but it can also take place in a hospital, at one's home, or even over the phone. So it does not have to be so sterile and has to be so professional like in an office. It can be up to the person who needs the counseling to choose where they want to receive that counseling. Now that we have some important definitions aside, let's talk a little bit about grief group counseling. One-on-one counseling is not for everyone. Some people decide that they would rather have the support of a group to aid them through their grief process. Worden claims group counseling for grief can be very efficient and can also be a very effective way to offer the emotional support the bereaved person is seeking. Why does group counseling exist? Worden, the same author as mentioned above, tells us that grief counseling is necessary and available for emotional support, education, or social purposes. Sometimes groups begin for one purpose, which then evolves into another. So it exists for the support and the education of those who are mourning. Of course, as with any kind of counseling, there are risks and there are benefits. Let's talk a little bit about the risks. So in a group setting, only the person leading the group is guaranteed to be trained to and equipped to answer questions and deal with heavy feelings pertaining to grief and loss. Other members might throw out unhelpful or harmful thoughts and opinions. In attending a group, members also run the risk of experiencing those who are disruptive, non-participatory, people who believe their loss is greater than others, or even people who share too much. And that was all from Worden, 2018. Group counseling might not be well suited for those who need more time to process through their grief with a trained professional, such as a counselor. Finally, I would also not recommend group counseling for those who require one-on-one attention. Group counseling is a time to share and also a time to listen and absorb other members' thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So if the person did not feel like they were equipped or ready to do that, I would not recommend it for them. However, there are also numerous benefits. It's amazing for people who process their feelings best externally, and also for those who are experiencing continuing or temporary problems that information alone will not resolve. So the complete part of that quote that I'm taking from Gazda, 1984, states that secondly, group guidance makes an indirect attempt to change attitudes and behaviors through accurate information or an emphasis on cognitive or intellectual functioning. Group counseling makes a direct attempt to modify attitudes and behaviors by emphasizing effective involvement. So group counseling is amazing for people who want to change their perspective, want to gain some perspective, need a group for support, or they just have questions that simply can't be answered or resolved through counseling alone. Who gets to come to a group grief counseling session, and how do we arrive there? Well, this is where the pre-screening process is so important. Worden tells us that it is important for the group moderator to consider several factors in their pre-screening process so that the group is as homogeneous as possible and so that members can get the most out of their time in group counseling. Some factors that a leader might want to consider are how recent is the loss? Worden explains it is important not to include people whose loss has been 6 weeks prior or lesser. Most people this early in bereavement are not ready for a group experience. So he thinks it would better serve the individual to process one-on-one with someone before that time period. Another thing to consider, would a same-gender group be most helpful? So sometimes it is easier for men to open up with other men and women to open up with other women. In mixed company, this may be more difficult for some people, although of course this is not universally true. Another thing to consider, the number of losses. Will this be a group for people who have experienced many losses at once, or will it be a group for those who have experienced a single recent loss? And finally, the types of losses. So some people's losses are harder to talk about than others, such as suicide. A suicide-specific group might be more helpful than a miscellaneous grief counseling group for those who are looking for maximum support, especially for such a traumatic death as suicide. Another important thing to note is that we need to define some group expectations, and we need to develop and explain some ground rules. And now we get to talk a little bit about the group counseling process. When and why is it time to recommend? As stated earlier from the article written by Gazda in 1984, group counseling is for those who are experiencing continuing or temporary problems that information alone will not resolve. Group counseling is also for those who are grieving and is necessary when a client feels isolated or alone in their grief. So group counseling in particular is really good for people who are starting to feel alone in their grief. They don't feel understood by people in their lives, maybe family members or maybe people in their community, friends, and they're like, hey, I really need some support, and I need people around me who have gone through the same thing that I have gone through, and I need to know that I'm not alone and that I'm not crazy. What is the role of support groups in grief counseling? The purpose of group counseling or support groups is to provide those grieving with emotional support, education, or social purposes. So the role of a support group in grief counseling, or the role of a group counseling session, is really to just help people know that they're not alone and